Is Australia still the lucky country? Look, that phrase has been part of our national identity for decades. But in a world of rising costs, global competition, and shifting demographics, does that still hold? Hi, I'm Michael Yardney, and welcome to this week's Demographics Decoded podcast, where leading demographer Simon Kirstenmacher and I unveil the trends shaping our futures. Simon, today I'd like to explore where Australia stands compared to other nations and how much our position has changed since, let's say, the 1990s.
Yeah, it's exciting because what do we love more in Australia than figuring out where we are in relation to other places? Yeah, we do really appreciate putting ourselves in context, and we'll be doing this with a bit of data and a couple of benchmarks today.
Fantastic. So whether you're an investor, a business owner, or just curious about how Australia stacks up, hey, stay tuned because this could be a fascinating conversation about prosperity, perception, and our future. So, Simon, let's look at the numbers. Like, how does Australia's GDP per capita rank us in the global economy? I noticed actually it ranks us above Canada and Netherlands, but what does it actually mean? I also want to explore a bit about how that's all occurred, what's happening around the world at the moment. Simon, people have been calling Australia the lucky country since, I think it was the 1960s. Donald Horne phrased it. But back then, I think he actually said that tongue in cheek. He didn't actually mean we were lucky.
I think the reference pretty much meant, thank God we are lucky with all the resources because we aren't overly smart. We're not
That's
actually
right,
doing
yes.
all that many smart things in this country, and we still luck out. So dumb luck is maybe the reference that was hinted at. And it is true. We've mentioned this on the podcast before that Australia in the last 30 years or so did fall behind in quite a few rankings. If you measure something like a global innovation index, we keep slowly sliding behind it. There's a thing called the Global Economic Complexity Index, 130 countries. We are 98th in that ranking, just behind Uganda. So
Wow.
we are not overly complex. We are lucky. But the little things that we do have do provide us with quite a bit of GDP. And again, we mention this regularly. It is mining, it is agriculture, it is tourism, it is international education that we export as this country. And those four things don't make for an overly complex economy, but they do make for a nice bit of export dollar that flows into Australia. And that ultimately then leads to a nice and high GDP per capita that we record. As you said, we rank always somewhere in between Canada, Denmark, the Netherlands. These are good places to be associated with because these are prosperous places. And we must remember that Australia is a prosperous place, even if some indicators point downwards or stagnating or aren't growing as fast as we might desire. So that's where the general comparison of Australia to other nations is really helpful so that we do not get caught up by some sort of squiggly line that says our GDP growth slowed a bit or whatever we look at.
We'll look at GDP in a moment, but there's also other ways of ranking Australia. And in many ways, we rank very highly in wealth, in the national wealth, in the wealth of each person. But let's put some context to it. What is GDP and how is that ranked?
Well, so GDP is just the economic output of the country. We tend to measure that in dollars, and we tend to always go to GDP because it is such an easy measure to actually count. People say, yeah, it's imperfect. It doesn't really show something like the happiness of a population, the health of a population. These ultimately the important things in life. And kind of like, yeah, sure, but they are a bit harder to measure. So part of this is just laziness, but it's also convenience. And it is a reasonably good proxy. So we must remember that it is the more money you have, the more problems you can solve that might come your way. So therefore, money is actually linked to happiness. It is linked to better health in broad brush strokes, not as a the sole aim of your life shouldn't be to accrue wealth. It should still be to strive for happiness and for safety and a wonderful environment, a peaceful government if you are a country. So that's the kind of stuff that we would or should strive for.
Well, I've often said any problem that money you have can solve isn't really a problem at all. So therefore, that'll get rid of some of your problems. So GDP per capita is something else where you actually divide the country's GDP by its total population. And on that basis, we haven't been doing as well lately. I guess it's sometimes a bit hard when you compare it with countries with much smaller populations.
Of course, yeah. So who tends to do really well in those GDP rankings are tiny countries. We're thinking of Qatar, we're thinking of Luxembourg. These are tiny places who have some sort of juicy financial industry or that might have a lot of oil, even though they're just a small population. Of course, they rank statistically extremely high. And so if you look at the top 10 or top 20 rankings of countries by GDP per capita, we are actually one of the largest countries in the mix then. So the overall size of the economy also does play an importance. And of course, just technically speaking, it makes sense if you have a surge of migration, as Australia has seen over the last 2 or 3 years, then technically speaking, you add a couple of hundreds of thousands of people, and these people are then also included in your GDP per capita calculations. Unless those migrants immediately create more GDP than the average, this technically drives down the numbers. Does this immediately translate into a decline of living standards? Not necessarily, but it's just a mathematical equation that might make it look so. And yeah, I can only always encourage people to think about your status quo and to think about the privileges and joys that we still have here, even though we are, of course, as an aspirational nation, constantly looking to the next step ahead. And we do get very nervous if a figure like GDP growth or our own wage growth isn't as high as it could be. So we then get nervous, but you want to understand the baseline on which you're operating. That is still extremely high.
Well, Canada's often one of our closest comparisons, a similar size country and similar challenges, but their GDP per capita is considerably lower than ours. Why is Australia's performance so much stronger?
So mining is the simple answer. Mining is juicy. You create heaps of dollars through mining. One fun exercise you can do with GDP is you can take the GDP that each industry in this country creates, and then you divide it by the number of workers in the industry. And just as a benchmark, high finance or property, these are two gigantic sectors, very, very financially lucrative sectors in Australia. They produce around $300,000 GDP per worker per year. And then you have mining, $1.1 million. So 3.5 times as big as high finance. Mining is very, very sexy, very, very attractive in Australia. And so the idea that Australia would slow down mining is inconceivable. We would not voluntarily slow down our wealth creation. So we will continue to mine, even if this might be difficult from an environmental perspective or something. Australia is hooked on this wealth, and we continue down that.
Well, clearly globalization and in many ways China's demand for our resources have been one of the drivers of our growth. We've also mentioned just a moment ago about education and tourism, but that's slowing down now, the international demand for our resources. What does that mean for the future?
So it means ultimately this is just a temporary thing. So you see that the population and economic growth in China slows down. The rate of urbanization slows down. So therefore, China needs less iron ore and coal to create the steel for their manufacturing, for their cities, for the urbanization. That ultimately then just means that the Australian resources need to find another market. There are plenty of China 2.0s out there. You know, these are your Philippines. This is something like Bangladesh, India. There are plenty of places that grow very, very fast from a much lower base. So therefore, they're not rich enough just yet to buy stuff in the Chinese way, or what was the Chinese way over the last 20 years. And that will come eventually. So structurally speaking, I'm absolutely convinced that there is demand for the stuff that we dig out of the ground, and that ultimately prices should be attractive enough to do this. So we will continue to see mining contribute to our GDP base, which then also creates a higher GDP per capita. So that is a very nice thing, and that's something that we have an advantage. You mentioned the Canada comparisons. The Canadians also have resources, not just as much mining. They're now thinking about large scale American style fracking a bit more and so forth. That would then actually create more GDP for them at a higher environmental cost than our mining, for example. But so these are the balancing acts that you want in an economy. And ultimately, very few nations are willing to sacrifice significant amounts of economic growth for environmental or moral reasons, to be fair.
Well, we started talking about, is Australia still the lucky country? And from what you're suggesting, we should be feel very fortunate that we live here and our future looks good. Being a demographer, where would you put demographics and immigration into that mix of things that have driven our growth over the last couple of
Well,
decades?
it's huge. And the standard argument is, of course, that a fair chunk, some people say all of our GDP growth in the very recent past was just driven by migration. Because every worker, every international student as well, that you throw into the country creates a bit of wealth just by the sheer fact of having a job, by creating products and services that adds to the GDP base. So overall, that then creates the pie that is the Australian economy to go up. That's fair. And we did see this big surge of migration in the last 2 or 3 years, which of course, again, we mentioned it plenty of times before. If you average out the migration intake from the beginning of the pandemic until today, you compare it with the same amount of time before the pandemic, we are even. There has not been no surge. We just played catch up with migration figures because we have still very low unemployment and we had plenty of empty spaces that the universities wanted to fill, and international students make up such a big share of the migration pie. So that's what we did to do, and that's what we will continue to do. So yeah, growth is very heavily linked to migration, and it will continue to be in the future.
Now, we've obviously become a fortunate country. Have we invested this newfound wealth wisely, Simon? It seems much of it's gone into property, into housing, which, of course, being in the property field, I'm very happy and comfortable with. But I know other countries have actually put it into sovereign wealth funds. So have we been smart about our money?
No, I don't think so. I think we could have been richer as well. This is the standard argument, of course, that the Australia Institute, so the lefty think tank, pushes left, right, and center, that we essentially gave lots of our gas in particular away for free without earning enough tax dollars. That is scandalous. So we could have created more wealth in-house. That is naive. That is a problem. Then, of course, with the wealth that we did create, are we putting too much of it into housing? Should we drive house prices down proactively to then make sure that people invest this newfound wealth not into property but into the stock market? We have an underserviced stock market in Australia, which you could argue leads to wealth creation through more innovation and the companies doing more stuff. Ultimately, yes, we could have done more. Big fan of the idea of a national wealth fund. We technically have the future fund. You could also always argue that superannuation to a degree is a national wealth fund. It is in dollar terms. It is, we store gigantic amounts of value in superannuation, much more than other countries. But yeah, we could have done more. I would still say push more money into the future fund and then build long-term infrastructure that creates long-term wealth creation with this kind of fund. That's what I would like to see more. But yeah, I don't want to paint any kind of doom and gloom picture here. This is still working. It could be much better, but it's not a catastrophe at all.
Not at all. Australia's wealth in general is in their homes and in their super. In fact, Australians are very wealthy compared to world standards because a large percentage of us own our own homes. Recently, the Australian property market has increased to $11.7 trillion. I remember when it got to 9 trillion a few years ago, everyone was excited. There's a lot of debt against that, but it's only at about 20% overall. So a lot of Australians own their own home, especially the baby boomers. We've discussed that in previous podcasts. And that's the area that we at Metropole help our clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. So if you are listening to this, watching this, and are interested in taking advantage of this new phase of our housing market, the new phase of the property cycle, I'll leave a link in the show notes. Go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with one of our wealth strategists about how we can help you get your share of this in the many mixed messages that are confusing people. Now, Simon, you're giving a lot of advice to industry, to governments, to associations. Maybe you can quickly share how you help people in this interesting environment in this lucky country?
Yeah, well, we always look deep into the demographic crystal ball that is filled with longitudinal data. And we then try to figure out what this means for the future of Australia by deeply understanding how our customers make money, if they're a business, how our customers, if they're a government agency, if they are a local government area, who they are going to service, and what the big demographic challenges ahead are. Other than this, I'm writing columns, I'm presenting at events, and I do just that, which I consider great fun because it is, as I mentioned many times before, it is the closest thing to a crystal ball that we have to figure out
Yes.
what might occur in the near to medium term future. Long term, God knows what's happening. But for business and government cycle, I think these forecasts are spot on that we can pull from the data.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes so people can get in contact with you and your team to see how you can help them as well. Now, we talked about GDP a bit, and that's, well, GDP per capita even. Now, that's an average. It doesn't show the inequality. Do you think the average Australian today feels richer than they used to before?
That's the very difficult question. I think they don't. I think that, of course, who do you look at?
I agree with you both ways.
Who's the average Australian? Yeah. So if you look at the millennial generation, so people in their 30s and 40s now, they are the kids of baby boomers. And so they think, well, I probably won't end up as rich as my parents up to the point where I potentially inherit their money. But so that is, I think that's a bit of a difficult situation when people feel like the system, whatever that is, isn't working for them. That makes them disappointed. That makes them feel that something works against their favor.
Yeah.
And of course, and I think that's a big risk here as well, is that people put themselves into some sort of victim role, and you give away agency of your life. You give it to some sort of external power, and you say, it's the baby boomers that stole my wealth. It is the migrants that stole my wealth. It is the government that are morons. All those things might be true to a certain degree, but ultimately you absolutely minimize the share of responsibility upon your own life that you hold
Yep.
yourself. And that's a shame when we do this. And when this becomes a mass phenomenon, that's not helpful. So you do not want to live in a victim society. To be honest, Australia is the exact opposite of a victim society from its base setup. It is the idea that, yes, your town gets burned. Yes, your town gets flooded. Yes, another season of locusts is coming, or whatever it is. You soldier on. The actual national mindset wants the opposite, but occasionally we do fall in the trap here as well, as in many places around the world, to say that we are victims of poor policy, of poor this and that. It's all true, but then change it and change it in a proactive way rather than just bemoaning a fantasized past or something.
There are no rich victims. I think it's important to feel the pilot of your life, in control of where you're going, rather than just a passenger being driven along. So I agree with you that despite living in the lucky country and one of the best places, probably the best place in the world, in the best time in history, some people still are unfortunately feeling uncomfortable. And that's a lot to do with social media and the continual barrage of negative discussions there. But Simon, you write a lot. You write weekly in the New Daily that's not behind a paywall, so I'll leave a link to that in the show notes, and also in the Australian. And in a recent article in the New Daily, you compared Australia with the US, the UK, Germany, noting our unique strengths and some of our weaknesses. Where do we shine, and where are we falling behind in some of these other parts of the world compared to other parts of the world?
Yeah, so the idea is that I wanted this piece to look beyond the standard comparisons. Yeah? Obviously, we constantly compare ourselves with other colonial type nations that essentially developed their cities at around the same time as we did. And of course, the motherland, the UK. And so I want to say, well, who else could we compare ourselves to? And I really like the idea of comparing Australia to Brazil. I understand that there are differences, but we pretty much are the same size. We pretty much have a coastal population with an empty inland. The inland in Australia is red outback and it is green rainforest in Brazil, but it is uninhabited, and we might utilize it to a certain degree to create wealth by bulldozing valuable rainforest to grow soybeans in Brazil, or to just dig big holes into the ground in Australia. What we then, of course, can look at in a bit of an admiring way at Brazil is they have a more diversified economy than we do. They have manufacturing of cars, of airplanes.
Yes.
that we don't have. On the other hand, they went much more intense in building a society without a middle class. Bemoaned on this podcast many times before the hollowing out of the Australian middle class, the idea that we shrink the middle class and we add more people on the bottom and on the top. That has problems for social cohesion. And the Brazilians are extreme. You probably might have seen those photos of Sao Paulo, their famous photos where you have super sexy luxury dwellings on the one side, and then there's a big fence and you have a slum right next to it. And of course,
Yes.
massive razor wire and private security forces to protect the rich from the poor. That is the extreme case. We are not there yet. When I'm saying we're hollowing out the society, I'm not saying we become Brazil next Tuesday, but we move more towards the direction of Brazil rather than away from that in a social sense. And that is a problem. So that's my Brazil connection. I really love the Brazil comparison. As a German, I, of course, like to compare Australia to Germany, even if it's only for my own interest. But Germany points us to the idea that you can run a diversified economy based on super high wages. So we say, oh, we have high wages. This is holding us back. It's like, yeah, but if you invest into education, if you invest into really high apprenticeship programs, you can create this middle class, medium sized business landscape that creates wealth for middle skilled workers and that amps up the middle class. So Germany is the exact opposite, traditionally speaking, of Brazil in terms of social structure. So that really doubled down on the middle class. And I think it is helpful in thinking about what kind of apprenticeship models should we have, what kind of schooling system should we establish, that we take we at least look at Germany and figure out, could we learn a couple of lessons?
Well, I really value these sort of discussions because you've got this world perspective, and each week we discuss these. If you're a new viewer or listener to this podcast and you don't currently subscribe, please click the follow or subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening to this. And hey, why not go back to some of the previous episodes as well, because Simon and I have gone through a whole lot of demographic trends that are going to shape our futures, whether you're in business or just starting your career. Simon, though, looking forward, if we go forward, I don't know, 20, 30 years from now, what's going to drive Australia's prosperity moving forward? Are we going to be as successful as we were over the last 30 years? Are people still going to call us the lucky country?
I think they will. I do not see why our four pillars of wealth would turn against us. Mining, agriculture, tourism, international education will still provide wealth. They will still be in high demand. So I think Australia remains rich. Will we have managed to diversify the economy, to de-risk ourselves from temporary price fluctuations in mining or food prices, so to speak? I have my doubts, because to make sure that we become economically diversified, we need to massively drive down electricity costs. Some people that I heard said, if you want to make smeltering work in Australia, to make sure that we export fancy steel rather than raw iron ore, which gives you heaps more money at
Sure.
exporting that. We need energy to sit at around a third of the price that it currently sits at. Let's say we only need half it. Can we halve the energy costs in the next 30 years? Probably not. So therefore, I think it will be much more of the same for Australia, economically speaking. So unless anyone has a really good idea how we proactively diversify the economy, I'd say Australia continues on the same path than it has been on the last 30 years.
Well, interesting. Australia's been described the lucky country. And when we look back over those 30 years, it's easy to see why we've climbed the global wealth ladder, leveraged our resources and immigration, as you said. We've built a better standard of living, one that many nations envy, Simon. But Simon, you've also reminded us that these averages can hide inequalities. Not everyone feels lucky, especially when housing is unaffordable to some, wages are stagnating. The cost of living has risen over the last couple of years. And these challenges for the next generations of leaders, investors and entrepreneurs are now going to be to ensure that Australia does stay the lucky country, stay in the top 10 countries, remain a place where prosperity is broadly shared and sustainable. So perhaps the real question, Simon, I think to finish off isn't are we still a lucky country, but how do we stay lucky and smart into the future?
That's exactly it. So we have the basis that we need. And I think incremental economic diversification would be highly welcome. It's a massive uphill battle. And I would, of course, love to see a very, very long term strategic plan with a goal to drive energy prices down. That must be an explicit policy goal, because once this falls into place, all of a sudden, the natural advantages of Australia will become very clear. You would then be able to operate, let's say, a smelter in a country that is a safe democracy, that has the rule of law guaranteed, that is just a nice place to live in, a much more desirable place than many other places around the world. So then these things would fall into place. So for us, it's the idea of setting the base settings right, and energy and housing would be my first policy priorities.
Well, let's see. I don't know that I'll be around in 30 years. You may be, but we'll be around next week to discuss the trend shaping our futures in next week's Demographics Decoded podcast. Thanks, Simon.
Fantastic. I'll see you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information, because we don't know your specific circumstances.